The first sound was not the wind. The wind was a constant, a physical presence that screamed and clawed at the one-room cabin sitting 22 miles from the nearest anything that could be called a town. Martha knew the wind. She had measured its moods for 6 winters. This sound was different. It was a sharp, percussive crack that vibrated down through the floorboards and into the packed earth around her. It was the sound of something deliberate. She didn't move. Her body, broad and powerful, remained perfectly still on the low wooden stool. Beside her, Bucky, her golden retriever, lifted his head from his paws, a low rumble starting deep in his chest. Martha placed a heavy, calloused hand on his neck, and the rumbling subsided into a tense quiet. Her eyes, pale blue in the amber lantern light, scanned the space she had built. It was not a cellar. It was a tomb for the living, a 9-foot by 9-foot cube of engineered survival dug out of the unforgiving Wyoming soil beneath her home. The walls were reinforced with thick timbers she had hauled and set herself, the gaps chinked with a mixture of clay and straw. 3 walls were lined with shelves holding enough cured meat, dried beans, pickled vegetables, and flour to last 2 years. The 4th wall was dominated by a small, efficient brick fireplace, its flue a narrow, 6-inch diameter stovepipe that snaked up through the cabin's floor, disguised as part of the main hearth structure above. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint, metallic tang of iron. The only way in or out was a 4-foot square opening in the ceiling, currently sealed by a trapdoor made of 2-inch thick oak. But the trapdoor was just the first layer. The true gate was here, inside with her. Leaning against the wall was the real door, a slab of half-inch plate steel she'd had freighted from Cheyenne, fitted with a heavy round wheel handle that turned a series of thick locking bolts. When the storm hit its peak, she would haul it into place and seal herself in from the world above. Another crack, louder this time. The sound of stressed wood. It wasn't the storm tearing at the cabin. It was something trying to get in. She had built this place to survive the indifference of nature, the blizzards that could bury a house in a single night and freeze a person solid in their own bed. She had engineered it against the cold, against starvation, against the crushing, isolating weight of winter. She had not built it for this. She had not built it to survive him. The work had begun not with a shovel, but with a memory. The memory of a man in Rawlings, a drifter with eyes that smiled while his hand stayed balled into fists at his sides. He had followed her for 3 blocks, his footsteps a soft, predatory rhythm on the boardwalk. Nothing had happened. She had turned into the general store, and when she emerged, he was gone. But the feeling remained, a cold, oily dread that settled deep in her bones. It was the feeling of being assessed. Sized up. Marked. That night, back in her cabin, she had looked at her sturdy walls, her solid door, and realized they were meant to keep the weather out, not a person who truly wanted in. A determined man with an axe could be through that door in minutes. A window was a momentary inconvenience. Her safety was an illusion, a polite agreement with a world that was not always polite. The next morning, she had pulled up the floorboards in the center of the room and began to dig. Her body, which others saw as a burden, was an engine. She was a large woman, tall and wide, with the kind of deep, foundational strength that came from a life of hard, physical labor. She moved earth by the bucketful, her shoulders and back screaming in protest for the first week, then hardening into a grim, functional rhythm. She dug down 10 feet, hitting shale at 8.5, and spent a month chipping away at it with a pickaxe and a pry bar until the floor was level. The excavated dirt and rock were hauled out at night and scattered far downwind, a deliberate act to erase the evidence of her labor. She did not want a conspicuous pile of earth inviting questions. The construction was a slow, calculated process. She bartered for the timbers, claiming she was reinforcing the cabin's foundation. The bricks for the tiny fireplace were acquired over a dozen trips to town, a few at a time, hidden under sacks of feed. The steel door was the greatest risk. She'd told the freight master it was for a smokehouse, a heavy, fireproof door to protect her cured meats. He had grunted, unimpressed by the expense, and loaded it onto her wagon. Getting it into the cabin and down into the hole had nearly broken her, a multi-day ordeal of levers, ramps, and sheer, stubborn will. Bucky had watched the entire process, his head cocked, occasionally licking the sweat from her face as she rested, gasping for air. The space was an extension of her own mind, obsessively organized, ruthlessly practical, and born of a deep, abiding fear she never spoke aloud. She had built a fortress against a ghost, and now a body of flesh and blood was testing its walls. A voice cut through the wind. A man's voice, muffled by the storm and the floorboards. "Hello? Anybody in there? I'm caught in the storm." The words were a classic plea, the kind any decent person was honor-bound to answer. Martha's hand tightened on Bucky's neck. Decency was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were 22 miles from help. The voice was pitched to sound desperate, laced with a shivering cold that might have been real or might have been an act. She had heard that same feigned vulnerability once before, in the voice of a man trying to talk a widow into opening her door after dark. Martha remained silent. She was a stone at the bottom of a well. The voice called out again, closer this time, as if he were right at the door. "Please? I saw your smoke. My horse went down. I'll freeze out here." The silence from within her cabin was absolute. He would be seeing a home that looked deserted. The heavy shutters were barred, the door was locked. The only sign of life was the thin plume of smoke he'd mentioned, a calculated risk she had to take to keep the main cabin from freezing solid. He would assume she was simply gone, or a deep sleeper. But his next words told her otherwise. A heavy thud against the main door. Not a knock. A kick. "I know you're in there. I can smell the fire." The desperation in his voice was gone, replaced by a flat, hard edge of impatience. The siege had begun. She listened to his movements, her senses amplified in the subterranean quiet. The scrape of boots on her porch. The rattle of a window shutter as he tested it. A curse, bitten off by the wind. He was making a circuit of the cabin, assessing its weaknesses. She had very few. The windows were small, high, and shuttered from the inside. The door was oak, reinforced with iron straps she'd forged herself. It would hold for a while. But a while was not forever. She rose from the stool, her movement slow and deliberate. She checked the flue on the small fireplace, ensuring the drawer was perfect. Smoke was life, but it was also a tell. Too much, and he would know she was tending a fire right below him. Too little, and the carbon monoxide would kill her faster than he could. Near the fireplace, in a small wooden cage, sat a canary. Its bright yellow feathers were a stark splash of color in the earthen room. As long as it sang, the air was safe. It was her most sensitive instrument. She added a single, dense piece of seasoned oak to the firebox, enough to produce steady heat with minimal smoke. The sounds from above continued. A scraping, metallic noise. He was trying to pry a shutter loose. Bucky whined, a low, anxious sound. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The words felt loud in the confined space. She ran a hand over his back, the familiar texture of his coat a small anchor in the rising sea of her fear. She had prepared for this. Not for him, specifically, but for the abstract concept of a malevolent force. And a man with a pry bar, miles from civilization, was the definition of a malevolent force. Her gaze fell on the heavy, cast-iron skillet sitting on the small hearth, its surface black and seasoned. It was her primary cooking tool. It was also 9 pounds of dense, balanced metal. She had never fired a gun in her life. She did not own one. A gun was loud. A gun invited challenges. A gun could be taken and used against you. A skillet was just a skillet, until it wasn't. The prying stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, a new noise. A rhythmic, splintering thud. He had an axe. The axe blows fell with a brutal, metronomic cadence. He wasn't at the door. He was attacking the wall itself, just beside a window frame. He was smart. He knew the walls were the weakest point, solid logs though they were. Each impact was a visceral blow that she felt in the floor, in the packed earth of her sanctuary. Bucky paced the small space, his nails clicking softly on the hard-packed dirt floor. He looked up at the ceiling, then at her, his brown eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored her own terror. This was not the howl of a wolf or the scream of a mountain lion. This was the cold, industrial violence of a tool in a man's hands. It was the sound of her carefully constructed world being dismantled, piece by piece. She forced herself into a routine, a mental checklist to occupy her mind and fight the paralysis of fear. Check the air. The canary chirped, hopping from one perch to another. Air was good. Check the food. The shelves were laden, a testament to her foresight. Food was good. Check the water. 2 large barrels stood in the corner, filled with clean water from her well, hauled down bucket by bucket before the first freeze. Water was good. She had everything she needed to survive for months. But survival wasn't just about resources. It was about the integrity of the shell. And hers was being methodically breached. The chopping stopped. A new sound followed, the splintering crack of a log giving way, then another. He had made a hole. She could hear the wind whistling through it, a higher, thinner shriek than the gale outside. He was in. He was inside her cabin. The boots were on her floorboards now. Heavy, confident steps. No more pretense of being a weary traveler. This was the sound of an owner, an invader surveying his new territory. She could hear him moving through the small, single-room space above. The scrape of a chair being dragged. The clink of a tin cup being knocked over. He was searching. For what? Food? Money? She held her breath, trying to make herself smaller, to will her very existence into nothingness. Bucky stood rigid beside her, a statue of tense muscle, his gaze fixed on the trapdoor above. She laid a hand on him, a silent command to stay down. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Right above the trapdoor. She could feel his weight through the thick oak planks. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. Had he found it? Was there a seam or a crack, a faint outline she had missed? She had covered the trapdoor with a bearskin rug, its edges weighted down with furniture. It should have been invisible. Then, silence. A long, drawn-out quiet that was worse than the noise. The only sound was the howling wind outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. Had he given up? Had he taken what little of value she had in the cabin and left? It seemed too much to hope for. A man who would take an axe to a stranger's home in a blizzard was not a man who gave up easily. She waited. 1 minute. 5. 10. The silence stretched, becoming a presence in itself. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, just slightly. Maybe he had been looking for food and liquor, found her meager supplies, and decided to wait out the storm before moving on. An unwelcome guest was better than a violent intruder. She could wait. She was built for waiting. She had supplies, she had warmth, she had Bucky. She could stay in this hole for a month if she had to. The false tendrils of hope began to curl around her heart. It was a dangerous, seductive feeling. Safety. He was just a man, and the storm was a monster. Perhaps he had simply sought shelter and would be gone in the morning. She allowed herself to take a deep, steadying breath. A new sound. It was not from the cabin above. It was from the wall beside her. A faint, scratching noise, coming from the stovepipe, her flue. Her lifeline. Her air. Her blood went cold. He hadn't been standing on the trapdoor to get in. He had been inspecting the hearth. He had followed the flue. The scratching was followed by a metallic tapping, then a voice, distorted and hollow, echoed down the narrow metal pipe. "I know you're down there." The voice was calm, conversational. All the manufactured desperation was gone. It was the voice of a man holding all the cards. "Found your little hidey hole. Clever. Very clever. My partner, Peter, is the one who spotted the vent pipe on the roof. Said it looked strange. Too small for a main chimney partner. The word hit her like a physical blow. There wasn't one man. There were two. She was not besieged. She was surrounded. So here's the deal, the voice from the pipe continued, casual, as if discussing the weather. You can open up that trap door, and we can all be civilized about this. Or, I can take this sack of dirt here and block your little chimney. It's your choice. But I'll tell you, it gets mighty hard to breathe when the smoke has nowhere to go. The threat was elegant in its simplicity. He wouldn't have to break in. He wouldn't have to find her hidden door. He would just have to wait. He would use the very systems she had designed for her survival to kill her. The fire that kept her warm would poison her. The enclosed space that kept her safe would become her tomb. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. "What do you want?" she finally called out, her voice raw. She hated herself for speaking, for acknowledging him, but she had to buy time. She had to think. The voice from the pipe held a note of amusement. "What do we always want? A warm place to stay. Some food. Whatever valuables a smart, prepared woman like you has squirreled away. We've been watching you for a week now. So you haul in your winter supplies. Knew you were a planner." They had been watching her. The cold dread from that day in Rawlings returned, magnified 100-fold. This wasn't random. It was targeted. They had chosen her. They had seen her strength, her solitude, and marked it not as a deterrent, but as an opportunity. "You seem like a reasonable woman," the voice cooed. "No need for this to get ugly. Peter's getting impatient. He's not as gentle as I am. And your dog. We can hear him whining. It would be a shame if something happened to him." The mention of Bucky was a calculated strike, and it landed perfectly. Her fear curdled into a cold, hard rage. The canary in its cage suddenly fluttered, landing clumsily on the floor of the cage. It was a subtle, terrifying signal. The air quality was already changing. He must have partially blocked the flue already, testing her. She looked at her small, perfect world, the neat shelves, the warm fire, the sleeping dog who was her only family, and felt it shrinking, the walls closing in. The air was getting thick, heavy. A faint headache began to throb behind her eyes. She was in a box, and her enemy controlled the lid. Every breath was a gift from him. He wasn't just trying to get into her sanctuary, he was trying to turn her into a willing participant in her own violation. He wanted her to open the door. To surrender. To give him the power. She looked at the heavy steel plate, the will handle that would seal her in. It was designed to keep things out. It could just as easily keep her in. Trapped. The canary was on the bottom of the cage now, its beak open, its breathing shallow. The first wave of dizziness washed over Martha. Hypoxia. It wouldn't be a violent death. She would get confused, then sleepy. She would simply lie down and fail to wake up. Bucky, too. He was panting now, a confused look in his eyes. She had built this place to survive a storm, not a siege. The logic of her fortress had been turned against her. Hiding was no longer an option. Staying here meant a slow, quiet death. Going up there meant a violent, uncertain confrontation. But it was a chance. Down here, there was no chance. There was only the inevitable. Her decision was made. It was not a choice, but a conclusion reached through brutal logic. She moved with a sudden, shocking speed. First, she threw open the firebox door and used a small shovel to scoop the burning logs out onto the dirt floor, smothering them with a bucket of sand she kept for that purpose. The smoke thickened for a moment, then began to clear. She could not afford to feed the poison. Next, she grabbed the skillet from the hearth, its weight familiar and reassuring in her hand. She moved to the barrels of water and submerged her head, soaking her hair and the collar of her wool shirt. The shock of the cold water cleared her head, pushing back the fog of oxygen deprivation. She took a deep, ragged breath of the thinning air. Bucky watched her, whining, sensing the shift in her. She put a finger to her lips, then pointed to the corner, a silent command to stay. He obeyed, sinking to the floor, his eyes never leaving her. She stood directly beneath the trapdoor, the heavy skillet held ready in a two-handed grip. She had one advantage, the element of surprise. He thought she was a trapped animal, slowly suffocating. He would not be expecting an attack. He would be expecting a plea. A surrender. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She acted. With a surge of strength born of desperation, she drove her shoulder into the underside of the heavy oak trapdoor. It flew open with a crash, smashing against the leg of the table she'd placed over it. Cold, clean air rushed down into the hole, a glorious, life-giving shock to her starving lungs. She scrambled out, moving with an agility that defied her size. The man was there, just as she'd known he would be. He was kneeling by the hearth, his back to her, preparing to block the flue properly. He was younger than she'd imagined, wiry and pale. He turned at the sound, his eyes wide with shock, his mouth opening to shout a warning to his partner. He never made a sound. Martha brought the cast-iron skillet around in a wide, horizontal arc. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening, wet crunch. He collapsed without a sound, a puppet with its strings cut. She didn't pause to check on him. She spun toward the cabin door, which was swinging open. The second man, Peter, stood silhouetted against the swirling grey chaos of the blizzard. He was larger than the first, with a thick beard crusted with ice. In his hand, he held a length of rope. His eyes widened, first at the sight of her emerging from a hole in the floor, then at the sight of his partner lying motionless by the fire. He lunged for her. She met his charge not by retreating, but by advancing, using her own considerable mass as a weapon. She slammed into him, driving him back out onto the porch, into the teeth of the storm. He slipped on the ice-slicked wood, and for a second, his balance was gone. It was all the opening she needed. She swung the skillet again, a desperate, upward blow that caught him under the jaw. He staggered back, falling off the porch and disappearing into the deep snowdrift that had accumulated against the cabin. She slammed the heavy oak door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into place. It was over. The immediate threat was gone. She stood in the center of her violated home, chest heaving, the heavy skillet still gripped in her hand, listening to the silence that was no longer threatening, but earned. The storm broke with the dawn. A pale, blue-gray light filtered through the windows, illuminating a world scrubbed clean and buried in white. The silence was absolute. Martha stood on her porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, Bucky sitting faithfully at her feet. The cold air was sharp and pure in her lungs. She looked out at the vast, undulating sea of snow. There was no sign of the second man. The snow had buried him, or he had fled into the storm to die. It made no difference. He was gone. The first man lay on her floor, covered by another blanket. He was still breathing, his life a problem for another day. For now, he was just a neutralized threat. Her gaze fell upon the open trapdoor in the middle of her cabin floor. The dark, earthen square looked like an open grave. For 6 years, she had believed her safety lay down there in that meticulously constructed hole. She had poured her fear, her strength, and her solitude into its walls. She had built it to survive the memory of a man, a ghost that had followed her from a dusty street in Rawlings. But when a real threat came, the bunker had not been her salvation. It had been her cage. Its walls had almost become her tomb. Survival had not come from hiding within her fortress. It had come from the moment she chose to leave it, to climb out into the danger and face it with a piece of cookware and the raw, unthinking power of her own will. She had built the perfect shelter, but she had survived because she was willing to abandon it. The fortress was the fear. The freedom was the fight. She looked away from the hole and toward the rising sun, a weak, white wafer in the winter sky. She did not feel safe. She felt strong. And for the first time in a very long time, she understood the difference.